Have you ever wondered why your buddy's 1970 Chevelle absolutely destroyed that new Mustang at the stoplight, even though the spec sheet said it shouldn't? Or why insurance companies suddenly started asking very specific questions about engine codes in the late 60s? Well, buckle up, because we're about to expose one of Detroit's worst-kept secrets, the great horsepower lie. Today we're counting down the top 10 muscle car engines that made way more power than the factory ever admitted. And trust me, some of these numbers are going to make you seriously question everything you thought you knew about classic American muscle. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more automotive truth bombs, and let's dive into this high-octane conspiracy. Number 10. The 1965 to 1967 Chevrolet 396 L78. Chevrolet claimed this engine made 375 horsepower. They lied, and everyone knew it. The L78 was basically a street-legal racing engine that Chevy somehow convinced the suits to let them sell to regular people. With its solid lifter cam, 11-to-1 compression ratio, and those gorgeous rectangular port heads, this thing was an absolute monster. Here's the thing about the L78 that most people don't realize. It wasn't just powerful. It was engineered to be powerful in a way that deliberately fooled dynamometers. See, back in 1965, manufacturers tested horsepower at the flywheel with no accessories attached. No alternator, no water pump, no exhaust system, nothing. Just a bare engine on a stand. The L78 was specifically designed to take advantage of this testing method. Those huge rectangular ports, they flowed air like nothing else in GM's lineup. The solid lifter cam, it had a profile so aggressive that mechanics would often think something was wrong when they heard it idle. But here's where it gets really interesting. When independent testers started putting these engines on chassis dynos with full exhaust systems and all accessories attached, they were seeing numbers closer to 425 horsepower. That's 50 horses Chevrolet just forgot to mention. Drag racers figured this out immediately. They'd show up at the track with their 375 horsepower Chevelle and absolutely demolish cars that should have been faster on paper. The most notorious example was probably the 1967 Camaro Z28 that Don Yenko built using the L78. Yenko knew exactly what Chevy was doing with their power ratings, and he wasn't shy about advertising the real numbers. His cars came with documentation stating 450 horsepower, and nobody who raced against them ever disputed it. Insurance companies eventually caught on, which is why L78-equipped cars became almost impossible to insure by 1968. There's actually a fascinating story about how this engine came to be. Bill Thomas, a famous Chevy racer, basically forced GM's hand by building his own high-performance 396 engines and selling them to customers. GM executives were horrified that someone outside the company was making better Chevy engines than Chevy was. So they rushed the L78 into production. The irony? They ended up building an engine that was even more powerful than what Thomas was making. They just couldn't admit it publicly. Number 9. The 1967 to 1969 Ford 428 Cobra Jet. Ford rated the Cobra Jet at 335 horsepower. This might be the biggest lie in muscle car history, and Ford executives knew exactly what they were doing. The 428 Cobra Jet was Ford's emergency response to getting absolutely embarrassed at drag strips across America in 1967. Chrysler had the Hemi, Chevy had the L78, Ford had problems. The Cobra Jet project started in a panic. A Ford dealer named Bob Tasca had gotten so frustrated with Ford's lack of competitive engines that he built his own 428-powered Mustang. He called it the KR8, and it ran mid-11 second quarter miles. This was devastatingly fast for 1967. Tasca drove it to Ford headquarters in Dearborn and basically said, "Build this or keep losing." Ford's engineers took one look at his creation and immediately started sweating. What Ford came up with was brilliant and sneaky. They took the 427's tough bottom end, topped it with 428 police interceptor heads, and added a massive 735 CFM Holley carburetor. That carburetor alone should have been a dead giveaway. You don't put a 735 CFM carb on a 335 horsepower engine. That's like putting racing slicks on a golf cart. It doesn't make sense unless you're hiding something. The real output? Independent dyno testing consistently showed 410 to 425 horsepower. Ford knew this. Hell, their own internal testing showed these numbers, but they deliberately rated it at 335 horsepower for one simple reason: insurance. A Mustang with 335 horsepower was insurable for a 25-year-old. A Mustang with 425 horsepower wasn't insurable for anyone under 40. The drag racing community figured this out on day one. The first 1968 Mustang Cobra Jets that showed up at NHRA events were immediately banned from stock classes. They were running times that were mathematically impossible for a 335 horsepower car. NHRA officials actually tore down several engines looking for illegal modifications. They found nothing. The engines were completely stock. They were just making 90 horsepower, more than Ford claimed. There's a legendary story about the Cobra Jet's debut at the 1968 Winter Nationals. Ford brought 50 white Mustang Cobra Jets as promotional vehicles. They let journalists and dealers drive them. Within hours, every single person who got behind the wheel knew Ford was lying about the power. One journalist wrote, "Ford says 335 horsepower. My butt dyno says they forgot to carry the 1." By the end of the weekend, Ford had pre-sold every Cobra Jet they could build for the next 6 months. Number 8. The 1969 to 1970 Pontiac Ram Air IV 400 Pontiac said 370 horsepower. Pontiac lied through their teeth. The Ram Air IV wasn't just underrated, it was a completely different animal than what Pontiac pretended it was. This engine was basically a NASCAR motor that somehow ended up in street cars. And the story of how that happened is absolutely wild. It started with Pontiac's racing program in 1968. They developed these incredible round-port cylinder heads for NASCAR that flowed air like nothing anyone had seen before. The ports were so large that engineers joked you could stick your fist through them. These heads were supposed to stay on the track. They were never meant for street use. But Pontiac's performance division had other ideas. Jim Wangers, Pontiac's ad man, and the godfather of the GTO, convinced management that they needed something special for 1969, something that would destroy everything else on the street. He wanted those NASCAR heads in a production engine. Management said it was impossible. The cam profile alone would make it barely streetable. Wangers said, perfect. The Ram Air IV was rated at 370 horsepower at 5,500 RPM. This was hilarious to anyone who actually drove one, because the engine didn't even wake up until 5,000 RPM. Peak power came at 6,000, and it would happily spin to 7,000 if you were brave enough. When properly tuned, with headers and decent exhaust, these engines were making 410 to 420 horsepower. Easy. But here's the really interesting part. Pontiac deliberately sabotaged their own dyno tests. They used restrictive exhaust manifolds during testing. They ran conservative timing. They even used a smaller carburetor than what actually came on the production engines. Why? Because they were already on the insurance industry's watch list. The regular Ram Air III had caused enough problems. If insurance companies knew what the Ram Air IV really was, it would have been uninsurable. The cam in this thing was absolutely ridiculous for a street engine. It had 308 degrees of duration and 520 thousandths of lift. For comparison, a normal performance cam of the era had about 280 degrees and 450 thousandths lift. This thing loped at idle like it was having a seizure. Pontiac actually had to include a warning in the owner's manual about the irregular idle. They called it characteristic of the high-performance camshaft. Translation: this thing idles like garbage, and that's normal. Only about 1,200 Ram Air IV engines were built for 1969 and 70. Today, they're among the most valuable Pontiac engines ever made, and every single person who owns one knows the truth about the power. At Pontiac gatherings, Ram Air IV owners have their own little club. They call themselves the 410 Club, not because Pontiac rated the engine at 410 horsepower, but because that's what it actually made. Number 7. The 1971 to 1972 Mopar 446-pack Chrysler claimed 390 horsepower. Chassis dyno said otherwise, way otherwise. The 446-pack was Mopar's middle finger to the insurance industry. By 1971, everyone was playing the horsepower underrating game, but Chrysler took it to an art form with the 446-pack. This engine was their way of giving customers big block power while keeping insurance agents in the dark. The six-pack name came from the 3 two-barrel carburetors sitting on top of the engine. That's 6 barrels total, if you're counting. And you should be counting, because those 6 barrels flowed an absolutely ridiculous amount of air and fuel. The center carb handled normal driving, but when you stomped on it, vacuum actuators opened the 2 outboard carbs, and suddenly you had the equivalent of a 1200 CFM carburetor dumping fuel into a motor that Chrysler swore only made 390 horsepower. Here's what made the six-pack special. It wasn't just about airflow. Chrysler used a different cam than the standard 440. They used heavier valve springs. They used a forged crank instead of cast. They basically built a race engine and then told everyone it was just a slightly warmed-over 440. The automotive press wasn't fooled. Hot Rod Magazine Dyno tested a completely stock 1971 Plymouth Cuda with the six-pack, 428 horsepower at the wheels. After drivetrain losses, that meant the engine was making close to 430 horsepower at the crank. The really clever part was how Chrysler marketed it. They positioned the six-pack as the street version of the Hemi. More tractable, better street manners, easier to live with. What they didn't mention was that it made nearly as much power as the Hemi in real-world conditions. Drag racers discovered this immediately. Six-pack cars were running virtually identical times to Hemi cars, but they cost less to buy and way less to insure. There's this persistent myth that the six-pack was hard to tune, that the 3 carbs were constantly going out of sync. Total nonsense. The problem was that most mechanics had never seen a 6-barrel setup before. They'd try to tune it like 3 separate carburetors, but Chrysler had designed it as a single system. Once you understood that, it was actually easier to tune than a single 4-barrel. The factory service manual even said so, right there on page 147. Not that anyone ever read the manual. The insurance companies eventually figured it out, of course. By 1973, you couldn't insure a six-pack car for any reasonable amount if you were under 30. But for 2 glorious years, you could buy a car with 430 horsepower and insure it like it had 390. Chrysler knew exactly what they were doing. They were giving their customers a loophole, a way to own serious power without going bankrupt on insurance, and thousands of young guys took full advantage. Number 6. The 1968 to 1970 Buick 455. Stage 1 Buick said 360 horsepower. Buick was being modest, ridiculously modest. The 455 Stage 1 was the gentleman's express of muscle car engines. While everyone else was screaming about horsepower and quarter-mile times, Buick built a motor that made absolutely brutal power and pretended it didn't. This engine was the sleeper of all sleepers, and that was exactly how Buick wanted it. The Stage 1 started as a dealer-installed package in 1968. Buick didn't even want to build it initially. They thought their customer base was too sophisticated for the whole muscle car thing, but their dealers were screaming for something to compete with. Kids were walking into Buick showrooms, taking one look at the lineup, laughing, and walking straight over to Plymouth to buy Roadrunners. Something had to be done. What Buick engineers came up with was genius. Instead of chasing high RPM horsepower like everyone else, they built for torque. Massive, earth-rotating torque. The 455 Stage 1 made 510 pound-feet at just 2,800 RPM. For context, that's more torque than most modern diesel trucks. At 2,800 RPM, this thing was already pulling harder than most muscle car engines at their peak. But here's what nobody talks about. The Stage 1 cylinder heads were absolute works of art. Buick spent more time developing those heads than any other manufacturer spent on their entire engines. The ports were perfectly sized, the valve angles were optimized for flow, the combustion chambers were shaped for maximum efficiency. When you put a Stage 1 on a dyno, it made power everywhere. Idle to redline, no flat spots, no dead zones, just a massive wall of power that never stopped building. Independent testing showed the Stage 1 making between 400 and 420 horsepower. But those numbers don't tell the whole story, because the Stage 1 made that power at lower RPM than anything else. While a Ram Air IV or L88 needed to be screaming at 6,000 RPM to make power, the Stage 1 was done by 5,000. It made its power and got out. Like a gentleman. The craziest part? Buick could have easily made this engine produce more peak horsepower. All they had to do was install a more aggressive cam and let it rev higher. But they didn't want to. They knew their customers. These were doctors and lawyers and business owners who wanted to embarrass Corvettes at stoplights, but didn't want to sound like they were trying. The Stage 1 was refined power, sophisticated violence. It was perfect for the Buick brand, even if the sales department never quite figured out how to market it. Number 5. The 1968 to 1969 Chevrolet Z28 302 290 horsepower. That's what Chevrolet claimed. That number is so wrong it's almost insulting. The Z28 302 wasn't just underrated, it was deliberately disguised as something it wasn't. This was a pure racing engine that Chevrolet somehow convinced the government was a street motor. And the lies they told to make that happen are absolutely legendary. First, let's talk about why this engine existed. SCCA Trans Am Racing had a 5-liter displacement limit. That's 305 cubic inches. Chevrolet needed something to compete with Ford's Boss 302, so they took a 327 block and stuffed it with a 283 crank. The result was exactly 302 cubic inches, just under the limit. Perfect for racing, terrible for street driving, or so they wanted you to think. The published specs were hilarious. 290 horsepower at 5,800 RPM. Any Z28 owner will tell you the engine was just getting started at 5,800. Peak power actually came around 7,000 RPM, and it would spin to 8,000 if you had the guts. When properly blueprinted and with headers, these engines were making 360 to 375 horsepower. That's nearly 30% more than advertised. But here's the really incredible part. The valve train in this engine was exotic beyond belief. It used solid lifters with massive spring pressures. The push rods were special heavy-duty units that cost more than most complete engines' entire valve trains. The rocker arms were forged steel instead of stamped. This thing was built to rev like nothing else Chevrolet made, and they rated it at 290 horsepower. It was like claiming a Formula One car was a commuter vehicle. The camshaft in the Z28 was so radical that Chevrolet had to include special starting instructions in the owner's manual. You had to pump the gas pedal exactly 4 times before starting, no more, no less. The idle was so lumpy that the car would literally rock back and forth at stoplights. Chevrolet's solution? They set the idle at 1200 RPM from the factory. Most cars idled at 700. The Z28 couldn't even run that slow without stalling. There's this amazing story from 1969 car and driver test. They took a stock Z28 to the drag strip. First run, it went through the quarter mile in 13.8 seconds. The editors were confused. That was impossible for a 290 horsepower car. So they tried again. 13.7. They checked under the hood to make sure it was really stock. It was. They finally just published the times with a note saying, Chevrolet's horsepower rating appears to be conservative. That might be the understatement of the decade. Number 4, the 1970 Pontiac 455 HO 360 horsepower at 4,600 RPM. Pontiac must have been laughing when they wrote that down. The 455 HO wasn't just underrated. It was a complete reimagining of what a big block could be. While everyone else was chasing peak horsepower numbers, Pontiac built an engine that made stupid power everywhere. And then they pretended it was just a mild performance upgrade. The HO stood for high output, but Pontiac guys will tell you it really meant holy crap, oh my God. This engine was supposed to be the Super Duty 455, Pontiac's nuclear option for the muscle car wars. But then GM handed down a corporate edict: no engines over 400 cubic inches in mid-size cars. Pontiac's engineers were devastated. They'd spent 2 years developing the Super Duty, so they did what any reasonable person would do. They lied. They took the 455, which was technically compliant at 455 cubic inches, and basically built it like the band Super Duty: forged pistons, 4-bolt mains, huge port heads, a camshaft that belonged on a racetrack. Then they detuned it just enough to pass emissions and called it the HO, the 360 horsepower rating. That was measured with restrictive exhaust manifolds, a tiny carburetor, and conservative timing. It was like weighing a boxer wearing a suit of armor. Real-world testing showed these engines making 410 to 420 horsepower with just basic tuning. Headers and a decent exhaust pushed them past 450. But the torque was what really set the HO apart. 500 pound-feet at 3,200 RPM. You could leave a stoplight in third gear and still smoke the tires. It was absolutely ridiculous. The best part was how Pontiac marketed it, or rather, how they didn't market it. The 455 HO was barely mentioned in sales literature. It was a checkbox option buried on the order form: D-port heads, special cam, forged internals. None of that was advertised. Pontiac sold it as just another engine option, like choosing between AM and FM radio. Insurance companies had no idea what they were looking at. They saw 360 horsepower and calculated premiums accordingly. Meanwhile, owners were out there destroying everything at stoplights. There's this legendary story about a 455 HO development mule. Pontiac engineers were testing it at their Milford proving grounds. They had it in a nondescript Tempest, completely stock-looking. A test driver in a new Corvette pulled up next to them at the track's staging area. He revved his engine, obviously wanting to race. The Pontiac engineers looked at each other, shrugged, and accepted. The Tempest destroyed the Corvette so badly that the Corvette driver actually lodged a complaint, claiming the Pontiac must be some kind of experimental race car. Technically, he was right. He just didn't know Pontiac was about to sell it to the public. Number 3. The 1970 Ford Boss 429, 375 horsepower. Ford's lawyers must have come up with that number because the engineers sure didn't. The Boss 429 was quite possibly the most outrageous lie in muscle car history. This wasn't just an underrated engine. This was a full-blown NASCAR racing motor that Ford somehow convinced the DOT was a passenger car engine. The mental gymnastics required to rate this at 375 horsepower were Olympic level. Let's start with what this engine actually was. Ford needed to homologate their new semi-hemispherical heads for NASCAR. The rules said they had to sell 500 street engines with those heads, so Ford built exactly 500 Boss 429 Mustangs, not 501, not 499, exactly 500, the minimum number required. That should tell you everything about Ford's intentions. The heads on this engine were so massive that Ford couldn't actually fit them in a Mustang engine bay with the shock towers in place. So they moved the shock towers. They literally redesigned the front suspension of the Mustang to fit this engine. The hood had to be modified with a massive scoop. The battery had to be relocated to the trunk, all for an engine that supposedly made just 375 horsepower. When you put a Boss 429 on a dyno, the real numbers were shocking. 475 to 500 horsepower. Depending on tune and exhaust, some were seeing even more. This engine had ports the size of sewer pipes. The valves were massive 2.3-inch intakes and 1.9-inch exhausts. For comparison, a regular 428 Cobra Jet had 2.09 and 1.66-inch valves. The Boss 429's valves were so large they actually had to cant them at different angles to make them fit. But here's the really insane part. Ford deliberately made these cars terrible to drive on the street. They wanted to discourage regular customers from buying them. The cam was so radical the engine wouldn't idle below 1200 RPM. There was no power steering available, no air conditioning. The rear axle ratio was either a 3.91 or a 4.30, both terrible for street driving. Ford did everything they could to make sure only serious racers bought these cars. The most famous Boss 429 story involves Bunky Knudsen, Ford's president at the time. He wanted to drive one home from the office. The engineers tried to talk him out of it. They explained it was basically a race car. Knudsen insisted. He made it about 3 miles before pulling over and calling for his regular car. He later said it was the most violent, uncomfortable, and terrifying vehicle he'd ever driven. And this was the guy who approved it for production. Number 2. The 1970 Chrysler 426 Hemi 425 horsepower. Chrysler actually kept a straight face when they published that number. The street Hemi was the most powerful production engine of the muscle car era, and everyone knew it. But Chrysler had to play the insurance game like everyone else, so they picked a number that sounded impressive, but not completely insane. The real number? Try 470 to 500 horsepower, depending on who was doing the testing. The Hemi was never supposed to be a street engine. It was designed for NASCAR in 1964, pure and simple. The hemispherical combustion chambers, the massive valves, the dual 4-barrel carburetors, everything about it screamed racetrack. But when NASCAR banned it for being too dominant, Chrysler was stuck with all this development cost and nowhere to use it. So they did the only logical thing. They detuned it just enough to be street legal and sold it to crazy people. And when I say detuned, I mean they did the absolute minimum required. The street Hemi still had solid lifters, it still had dual quads, it still had those massive valves that flowed air like nothing else in production. They just gave it a slightly milder cam and called it street legal. It was like putting a muzzle on a dragon and calling it a house pet. The 425 horsepower rating was measured using every trick in the book. Small carburetors during testing, restrictive exhaust, conservative timing. They even tested it at a lower RPM than where it actually made peak power. Real-world dyno testing consistently showed 470 to 480 horsepower with stock exhaust manifolds. With headers, 500 was easy. Some builders were seeing 520 with nothing more than headers and proper tuning. But the Hemi's real advantage wasn't just peak power, it was how it made power. Those hemispherical combustion chambers were incredibly efficient. The engine could run more timing without detonation. It could handle more compression. It breathed better at high RPM than anything else. While other big blocks were gasping for air at 6,000 RPM, the Hemi was still pulling hard. The insurance situation with the Hemi was absolutely ridiculous. By 1970, You basically couldn't insure one if you were under 25. Some companies wouldn't insure them at all. Farmers Insurance had an actual written policy that said, no Hemis, not high-performance engines, or engines over 400 cubic inches. Specifically, no Hemis. It was like being blacklisted, which of course only made people want them more. There's this incredible story about the Hemi's development. When Chrysler was first testing it for NASCAR, they put one in a Plymouth Belvedere and took it to Daytona for testing. On its first full-throttle lap, it went faster than the official track record. On a test day, with nobody watching. The driver, Richard Petty, came back to the pits and said, "We're either going to win everything or get banned." He was right on both counts. Number 1, the 1969 Chevrolet L88 427, 430 horsepower. That's what Chevrolet claimed. That might be the most laughable horsepower rating in automotive history. The L88 wasn't just underrated, it was a barely disguised Can-Am race engine that Chevrolet sold to the public through a loophole in their own regulations. The real power? North of 550 horsepower, some say more. The L88 was never supposed to exist as a street engine. It was created for Can-Am racing, where there were basically no rules except must-have doors. Chevrolet engineers went completely insane with this engine, 12.5-to-1 compression, solid lifters with spring pressures that could cut glass, rectangle port heads that flowed more air than a wind tunnel, and then, somehow, they convinced GM management to let them sell it as a production option. But here's the genius part. Chevrolet didn't want regular people to buy this engine. It was too radical, too expensive to warranty, too likely to cause problems. So they hid it. You couldn't order an L88 with a radio, or air conditioning, or power steering, or even a heater. That's right, no heater, in a car sold in America. Chevrolet literally made it as unpleasant as possible to own one of these. The 430 horsepower rating was tested under the most conservative conditions imaginable. They used restrictive exhaust manifolds that wouldn't even fit in the car. They ran pump gas instead of the 103 octane the engine required. They limited the RPM to 5,000 when the engine was designed to spin to 7,000. It was like testing a Lamborghini in first gear and publishing those numbers. Real L88 owners knew the truth immediately. With proper fuel, headers, and correct tuning, these engines were making 550 to 575 horsepower. Some racing-prepped versions were pushing 600. At the drag strip, L88 Corvettes were running times that should have been impossible. Low 11s, high 10s. These were times that purpose-built race cars were struggling to achieve. The wildest L88 story involves a Chevrolet engineer named Zora Arkus Duntov. He wanted to prove how underrated the engine was. So he took a stock L88 Corvette to Bonneville. Completely stock except for safety equipment. He personally drove it to 171 miles per hour. Then he removed the engine, put it on a dyno, and documented 560 horsepower. He sent the results to GM management with a note. This is what we're really selling. Management's response was to immediately restrict L88 sales even further. Only 116 L88 Corvettes were sold in 1969. Chevrolet made it so difficult to buy one that most dealers didn't even know it existed. You had to know the option code, find a dealer willing to order it, and then wait months for delivery. And when it arrived, you got a car with no heater, a warning sticker about fuel requirements, and an engine that would barely idle. But you also got 550 horsepower in a car that Chevrolet claimed had 430. It was the ultimate sleeper, the biggest lie, and the #1 engine that made way more power than advertised. And there you have it. That's 10 muscle car engines that made way more power than the factory ever admitted. The funny thing is, everyone knew these numbers were fake. The manufacturers knew. The insurance companies eventually figured it out. The kids street racing definitely knew. But for a brief, glorious moment in time, you could walk into a dealership, buy a car with 500 horsepower, and insure it like it had 350. Those were the days. Which of these engines would you want under your hood? Let us know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into Detroit's biggest lies, hit that like button and subscribe for more classic car content. Until next time, keep those tires smoking.